Thanks so much, Edward, and thanks everyone for sticking around. I'm joined by Jennifer Bisceglie for Interos, founder and chief executive, and it's really lovely to have you here. We've just had a really rousing discussion about how we get to net zero and what we really do with our suppliers, and it'd be great to just hear a little bit about what Interos does and what your vision is for getting to net zero.
Well, thank you for having me, and I was glad I actually got to sit in on that last panel. That was exciting.
It was.
So what does Interos do? If you think about the world in the last 2 years and how it really proved out how hyper-connected we are, and again, the last panel really talked about it, right? The ability to flow, to affect change. What Interos does is it leverages technology and data, and I heard some data providers in here, so if you want to talk afterwards, we'd love to. But we ingest massive amounts of data to map out the world's supply chain. So right now we are mapping and monitoring about 350 million companies around the world, and we're understanding how they do business with each other. We're also looking across multiple risk areas. ESG and sustainability is one of those 6 that we look at, including cyber, including financial concerns. I think the interesting thing, and one of the gentlemen mentioned it, excuse me, is that the power is in the pocketbook right now. Consumers, whether it's B2C or B2B, are mandating these things. It is not going away. And there's a real opportunity to affect change by simply asking for it and holding others accountable.
Brilliant. And you mentioned data. This is something that really, really fascinates me because as somebody who is in charge of decarbonizing what feels to me a very complex supply chain, data tends to be the kind of sticking point. People say to us, oh, we just don't know. We don't know that information. We can't see beyond tier 1 or tier 2 of our supply chain. How do you solve that problem? What's your approach to getting into that nitty-gritty stuff?
So it's a couple things, and it is a hard problem. So one is the technology does exist. I started the company 17 years ago, and I started as a consultancy because technology didn't exist, artificial intelligence didn't exist, and big data wasn't used to gain the value and the transparency in the supply chain as it could be done today. So fast forward to the last few years, now we're the big data company. We got valued at $1 billion last year, so meteoric growth. I think the answer to the question, though, is and again, the last panel mentioned it, the technology exists. I think so much of this in affecting change really is around making a decision to get started. I honestly believe on some level that just saying data doesn't exist is a bit of an excuse, and we're kind of past that. And so most of us understand at least what the value set for our company is. So, one of the things that I find curious, and I'm not going to go toe-to-toe with anybody in this room because people have different definitions and understanding of ESG and sustainability, is just saying what's the value set of my company and holding others accountable to that. And so, simple things like, make sure that you're recycling within your office building. It's just simple things that don't necessarily, handle the regeneration of soil or anything. But it's just those simple things that get started. The data is being created, right? There are different, and I think EcoVadis is either in the room or was on one of the panels earlier, but there is data out there that's being created. But I do think that so much around ESG and sustainability can be affected by just figuring out what your value sets are and holding others accountable, as I mentioned.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because we as companies, and we do align ourselves to certain values and make that public, and then that's a relatively straightforward thing to understand. How do you think we begin to capture how people are doing against the sort of the net zero agenda? How do we understand how they're actually progressing rather than just saying how they're going to progress?
So really interesting. I had a conversation with one of the financial institutions before this session. Excuse me. There's a lot of the financial sector is actually creating instruments to kind of push these things, the ripple effect through the extended supply chain. So direct answer to your question is just to ask the question. I started my company to automate and leverage technology to really create this transparency and trust in the supply chain. But not so long ago, and literally 2 years ago when the pandemic hit, we were getting phone calls from major organizations that were still mapping and monitoring what was going on in their supply chain in Excel spreadsheets. It's not right. It's not automated. It's very point in time, but it's something. And so to be honest with you, as the data is still trying to catch up and automate, the first thing to do is to ask the questions. And I actually, personal opinion, I actually think that if we start asking those questions, it actually starts to formulate and advance the value systems and kind of the frameworks we all need to operate in. At the end of the day, business is going to solve a lot of these problems, right? We're in the business to solve problems, to remain profitable. So companies need to start talking to each other about this and saying, hey, this is what matters to me. Are you able to do this as well? And those questions will be answered, and then technology and data will catch up.
Interesting. Because we have, in the national health system in England, have set what we call our sort of supply roadmap. It's a really clear way of saying, okay, this is what we want. This is our expectation of our suppliers, this date, and that date.
Yeah.
And the feedback we're getting is sometimes really, most of the time, quite positive from our suppliers. Sometimes it's challenging. But what you say really rings true about the fact that sort of being clear about what it is that is expected and saying these are the things that these are the values that we have as an organization, and this is where we need you to be by this point, gives them a journey of travel. And so I think that's really, really important in terms of being able to set clear expectations of your supply chain. You mentioned as well, you talk about other areas of risk within the supply chain. So do you look at things like labor standards and human rights within the supply chain?
We actually do. And I want to touch on something that you just said. I'd actually codify that as almost a maturity model. One of the things that we're seeing really advance the motion is when you actually talk to your third parties, whether they be suppliers, whether they be business partners, what have you, but you talk to them and you ask them to meet your value system where they are based on the service or the product that they're providing to you. And I think that's the other piece to what you summed up my last question on, is that you can't, there's a lowest common denominator that says we will not partner with someone that engages in modern slavery. That's an easy one, right? That's a low bar. But on top of that, you may want to do more things, even, airlines, right? If you're an airline, we want a little bit more from you versus if you're, just providing recycled goods or what have you, or organics to my office. And so really working with your business partners and meeting them where they are, I think is really important. And we look at that through a maturity model. One of the areas that we've seen, and I'll answer your second question, we've taken off from this is around cybersecurity. So years ago, cybersecurity was, whether you're Lockheed Martin or you're a 5-person shop, thou shalt do X. And it was a 1,600-page manual. Nobody read it. Nobody did it. And then everyone was, sharing their breaches as you do. And what's happened is you have a cyber defense here in the UK. You have another regulation in the EU. The US has something literally called the cybersecurity maturity model certification. And it's got 5 levels. And it says, okay, everybody must be level 1 in effort to do business with the US federal government. The same thing can be done around ESG and sustainability. Now, if you're level 2, it's because you engage with me in this way. And it allows folks to have the journey that you just mentioned. And you know what? If I want to go to level 5, well, good for me. That's an increased investment. Maybe it makes me more competitive in the market because I say business partner, opportunity, RFP, what have you. Hey, I've actually over-invested in myself in effort to be more sustainable and to take care of this wonderful earth we live on. The answer to your question is yes, we do. And part of the reason that we look at a wide range of different types of risk is simply because we're global. And so we support customers globally. I mean, the 350 million entities that we look at are global companies, and we still haven't mapped all of them. And when I say all of them, all of the business entities in the world. So we're focused mostly on the developed countries, mostly, not all of it, but mostly. And because that's where a lot of the data is, that's where a lot of us are actually focused on the economy. But, what's interesting is back to the definition point and the maturity model. So in the States, and that just changed. I think today was the SEC ruling got published. It was great timing. But yesterday, the most that we really held each other accountable for in the States was around supplier diversity. Like how many women-owned businesses was I contracting with? And that was the heavy lift we had. This was a big step for the U.S. and the Biden administration. Whereas, I mentioned to you earlier, I'm here with my team every month, and I can't have a meeting in the UK or in Europe that doesn't really talk about carbon footprint and things. And so we really took it seriously, and modern slavery. So based on region, you have different asks. And honestly, to me, that goes back to the maturity model and the journey that you were just talking about.
Yeah. that maturity model, it's like you've read our website. It's really important because to a certain extent, you need to get everybody on at a certain level, and then you need a mechanism to recognize those that are doing more. And within our supply chain, with every supply chain, there are those that are the early movers and the real ambitious people that we're saying we want to give you that platform to tell us about all this fantastic work you've done. And then there are some that are not on board yet and need to get up to the sort of minimum level. So in terms of your work across Europe, do you feel that and the United States, I mean, do you feel that there's a bigger focus on carbon here in the UK and Europe than there is in the States? Is that something that's definitely more part of the conversation?
Definitely. And I think even interestingly enough, the companies that are US based that are doing work over here and they're being held accountable, the conversation's just different. And most of us know, I'm sure, in effort to work over here, we had to establish subsidiaries. And so it's actually looked at a different business entity. And when they do that, I won't say it's a way to get out of it, but it's a different lens to look at as far as the incentive. I'll be honest with you, I don't know that I run into many people in business or anybody here does that says, you know what, I don't want to take care of this earth anymore. I'm going to be here for 70 years and that's it, and it'll be okay. Nobody's looking at it that way, but it does come down to an investment. And I think that's where I go back to, this is a real competitive opportunity for the companies that invest early. It doesn't have to be perfect. It does have to be a decision, and it does have to be something that you can actually put out there, publish, and people can hold you accountable. I had the opportunity to speak at the Blackstone CEO Summit 2 weeks ago, and on the same topic. And it was really interesting because you have all of these, very successful CEOs in there that Blackstone is actually using our platform, and they are actually monitoring their portfolio companies. So this is not just competitive from, can I actually win on that RFP or tender? This is the actual valuation of the business. And that's where I go back to my opening statement around consumers are making decisions. My comms folks laugh. I keep saying, for the first time ever, my mother actually knows what I do for a living because she couldn't get product, on the store shelves when the pandemic happened, right? Which is not necessarily exactly what we do, but it's close. And but the consumers, you can now buy a Nike sneaker by going to the website and looking at the provenance of the supply chain, right? You can do that from a food and agriculture standpoint. Look at what happened to Nike and H&M last year. Time flies around anymore, with cotton. And so there's a real focus on transparency and trust in the supply chain, and using that as an economic driver in effort to make this world a better place.
Yeah, I think with the consumer participation in this is going to be the real game changer.
Sure.
Because, at the moment, big organizations can say, we want to do these things, this is important to us. But we don't necessarily always have the decision maker at the point of purchase asking for those same things. Sometimes that can be quite a disjointed thing in an organization. And actually, as we get more consumers understanding this and having mechanisms to understand it better, there's some sort of ideas of sort of a kind of almost a Wikipedia for products, so that you would be able to look and say, like you mentioned about the Nike sneaker, like you'd be able to understand where it comes from, what its impact is, how much water it took to produce it, et cetera. So I think that feels to me like the area where we're going to start to begin to, the last session we talked about, decarbonizing the thing rather than the system. And actually, we really do need to understand each and every thing as well. And I think that's going to change when we get the consumer involved.
Well, last time you all took an Uber, you can actually look at the carbon footprint from Uber, right? Amazon is starting to post things on their website that you can choose the products based on the carbon footprint. And so I think you're exactly right that is where it's going to happen, and B2B is going to pick up on it. So much of what's happening in the supply chain, and pick your concern right now, is around brand and reputational harm. Right, the numbers are out there. The disruption, depending on from an overall global standpoint, every time there's a supply chain disruption, on average, it's costing a company about $184 million US. Just for an ESG disruption to the supply chain, you're about $30 million. And they're feeling these every other month. So, 6 times a year. And so those things add up. And oh, by the way, that's just the financial interruption of the business. That is not around the brand, where the consumer can say, they walk with their wallet and they walk with their feet. Another point, you touched on a minute ago, is the younger generation, and I'm looking around because I'm feeling old right now, but the younger generation is really saying we will align with these brands or we won't. And there's a lot of power in social media out there. There are no secrets anymore. This stuff is being published. And so I do think that it's the pointy tip of the spear. And we think a lot of times that it's a B2B problem, but I do think the consumer is ultimately going to start making these decisions, and it's going to push back.
Yeah, it's going to be a really important kind of meeting of the kind of corporate pushing plus the consumer asking for it. I'm conscious that we have about 5 minutes left. Are there any questions on Slido?
We do indeed. We've got a question here. What are the good questions to ask to move our companies to act more in accordance with their values, especially in companies that see sustainability as a hygiene factor?
So it's an important question, and that's where I go back to the value system and holding accountable. This can't be something that you do once and just say, check. This is not necessarily, in my opinion, a compliance activity. This is an ongoing monitoring and an ongoing conversation. And so I think that it's got to start with what's important to you and what are you actually able to do repeatedly that you can scale from. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I don't know that's looking at it as a hygiene problem is such a bad thing. Because again, and I liken this to cybersecurity, in the fact that cybersecurity has a maturity model that we can learn from. It's easily leverageable. And oh, by the way, it's been published that 70% of the cyber breaches could have been fixed by hygiene, by changing passwords, right? By a little bit of education. And so if I think about what's that lowest bar, it's always got to be what can you actually hold yourselves accountable to? What is important to you based on what you do? So different for a food company than it is for an airline. And what is something that you can consistently do and hold each other accountable for? Because if the last 2 years taught us anything, it is that we are one global hyper-connected economy. And therefore, there's going to be some sort of cascading effect when you start making these changes for better or for worse. And you don't want to just do it as a one-off because no one's going to follow you.
Great, thank you. There was a question, I think, at the front. Unless there's one. I don't know if there's more on side. Just up here, first row, and then go to this afterwards.
Thank you. No, just had a question. I wondered if you think that the different access to data in different countries will kind of reflect into a discriminatory preference for trade for those countries where there is better access to data. So as companies have to report more, they might actually prefer those suppliers in countries or where there are better infrastructures or where there is more or better access to data.
Such a great question. And I think you touched on it earlier. There are countries that don't have the data, period. I think that as much as we don't want to go too deep into what's happening with Ukraine and Russia right now. It's actually a very interesting example in that we are literally, with sanctions, cutting off whole parts of our developed manufacturing world, right? Access to raw materials. So you now have exactly what you're talking about. You have the entry into the global economy, the opportunity for countries that may not have the manufacturing capability, but they have something that says, hey, I can do that too. I think that this goes back to the value system that I mentioned, that says, you know what, I'm not going to engage with you if you're engaged with modern slavery. Is that a problem? I'm okay. You might not have all the data, but if I can tell you what's important to me and what I need to hold you accountable for, and we can have that conversation, the data becomes available. And I do think that that's what's going to happen, is we're going to start pushing into different parts of the global economy, and the data will consistently be more available. The good news is we have models, right? We kind of know what data, we don't have a good definition yet, that we all agree on, but we do have the type of data we're looking for. So the data in the undeveloped areas where it's not available will come. I think that if I'm buying from you and you don't have the data, then I have to make sure that my value system is still honored, that I understand what that model is. And there's a give and take that says, you know what, I really want to have access to you. I know you're not dealing with modern slavery, and not you, of course, but that is my bar. And therefore, the trade-off of you not having the data today, but let's put a maturity model in place that allows me to have the data from you in 3 years. Now we can work together on that. And I think that that's actually just natural, the economic situation. And I mentioned this is business solving business problems, but I think it's a great point.
Great, thank you. We've got a little less than a minute left, but I'd like to take your question and then we'll just wrap up.
Time went fast.
I know.
Thank you. Quick question. What would you say to responses about anti-competitive behavior? So if you label certain products with carbon emission scores, doesn't that give those companies ability to sue you for on anti-competitive grounds?
So not a lawyer, but I think that this is where I look at it as a business problem to be solved, not a legal action, right? And so I can choose in the world of free trade who I do business with and who I don't do business with. And again, this is where I go back to the maturity model or understanding the value system. If I've put out in an RFP or a tender, thou shall align to these items, and one of them is what you just said, from a carbon footprint, you either can meet it or you can't. And I can choose to do business with you or I don't. And that's really what I'd love to see. And I think those things are happening from the financial institutions creating products, businesses making decisions to align their value system. Business will come forward and actually create this cascading effect that allows this earth to continue.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank
It's
you.
been brilliant speaking with you. And thank you all for your attention. It's brilliant to see such a packed crowd. So if we can just give Jennifer a big round of applause. Thank you.